On a distant planet, the war had lasted for years. Human soldiers, led by Sergeant Jackson Cole, had been sent to fight against a growing rebellion. The enemy wasn't just any group of rebels. They were alien creatures with advanced technology and a fierce desire to overthrow their leaders. But Jackson had a secret mission: to find an informant who could tell the humans everything about the rebels' plans. And that informant was Zara. Zara wasn't the kind of person the humans expected. She was an alien, but not the kind with sharp features and sleek skin. She was rough, scared, and large, a walking symbol of everything her people believed was wrong with their species. In fact, she was considered ugly by both her own people and the human soldiers. Her skin was a dull gray, her eyes too wide, her features crooked. She didn't fit the standards of beauty anyone knew. Despite all that, Zara was smart. She had worked her way into the rebellion's trust, becoming an expert in their strategies and weapons. But Zara didn't care about the war. She didn't care about sides. She just wanted to survive, to escape the cycle of cruelty her people had been trapped in for centuries. Jackson wasn't thrilled about the mission. He was a seasoned soldier, and he had fought in many battles, but never had he been asked to trust someone as strange as Zara. His orders were clear: get the information, no matter what it took. He had no intention of making friends with her. He was just here to get the job done. The first time they met, it wasn't at a peaceful meeting place. Zara had been hiding in the ruins of an old city, far from the human army's main camp. It was a dangerous area, filled with traps and rebel soldiers. Jackson didn't want to go in alone, but he didn't have a choice. His orders were to meet her, and he couldn't risk bringing too many men into the area. The moment Jackson saw Zara, he felt something strange stir inside him. She wasn't what he expected. Her large, scarred face looked almost like a mask, one that had been through 1,000 battles. But what caught his attention the most was her eyes, deep, intelligent, and filled with anger. She wasn't just another soldier. She was someone who had seen too much. "Are you the one they sent?" Zara's voice was rough, almost like gravel, but there was no fear in it. She wasn't intimidated by Jackson, even though he stood tall, armed, and ready for anything. Jackson nodded slowly. "I'm here to get the intel. Nothing more." Zara stared at him, her eyes narrowing. She had heard of the humans, their brutal tactics, their endless wars, but she didn't care about their reputation. She had learned long ago that survival was the only thing that mattered. "What makes you think I'll help you?" she asked, crossing her arms over her chest. She had heard human soldiers were ruthless, but she wasn't afraid. She had dealt with far worse. "You don't have a choice," Jackson replied, keeping his tone cold. "We can either do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice." Zara looked at him for a long moment. She could see the strength in his eyes, the determination, but she also saw something else. There was a hint of respect in him, a strange feeling that made her heart beat faster than it should. She quickly pushed the thought away. She couldn't afford to feel anything for this soldier. "I'm not a tool for your war," Zara said sharply. "But if you want my help, you'll have to prove it's worth my time." Jackson studied her for a moment. There was no easy way to win her trust. She wasn't like the other alien contacts he had dealt with. This was a different kind of enemy, but something told him she wasn't fully loyal to the rebellion. There was more to her story than just survival. "I'm not asking for loyalty," Jackson said after a pause. "Just information. What's going on with the rebels? Where are they hiding?" Zara looked him over once again. For the first time, she seemed to soften, just a little. She nodded slowly, her sharp features still hard, but there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes. "I'll tell you what you need to know," she said. "But remember, this isn't for you. This is for me." Jackson's expression didn't change. "Whatever works." As they moved out of the ruins and toward the rebel stronghold, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that something about this mission was different. He had been trained to fight, to kill if necessary, but with Zara, he wasn't sure what kind of fight he was really in. And in the back of his mind, he wondered just what kind of person she was behind those harsh features. But whatever it was, he couldn't afford to let it distract him. The war had to end, and if it meant working with someone like Sarah to make that happen, then so be it. The rebel camp was a chaotic mess. The explosion had thrown everything into disarray. Rebel soldiers were scrambling, shouting orders, and grabbing weapons as they tried to regroup. Jackson and Sarah, both crouching low behind a pile of broken crates, exchanged a quick glance. "We can't stay here," Jackson said, his voice low. "If we don't move, we'll be trapped." Sarah nodded but didn't speak. She was already assessing the situation, her sharp eyes scanning the camp for an opening. Jackson could see the focus in her face. She wasn't just reacting out of fear. She was thinking ahead, planning their next move. "We need to strike fast. Take out the leaders," Sarah finally said. "Their command structure is falling apart. If we can hit them now, they won't be able to regroup." Jackson's instincts kicked in. He had seen enough battle plans in his time to know when to take a risk and when to play it safe. "We go together. No splitting up." Sarah didn't argue. She was used to working alone, but there was something about Jackson's steady presence that made her trust him, just a little bit. It wasn't the kind of trust she gave easily, especially after everything her people had done to her. But in the heat of the moment, it felt natural to move as one. They moved quickly, staying low and keeping their steps silent. Zara led the way, using her knowledge of the camp's layout to guide them to the main building, where the rebel leaders were most likely to be. When they reached the building, Zara stopped and looked at Jackson. "This is it. We break in, take them out, and get the intel." Jackson nodded. He didn't like the idea of going in blind, but there was no other choice. They had to finish what they started. Suddenly, Zara turned to him with a strange look on her face, something like uncertainty. "There's something else," she said, her voice quieter than before. Jackson raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Zara hesitated for a moment, and for the first time, Jackson saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. She had been tough and cold ever since they met, but now she was unsure. "I didn't just come here to help you defeat the rebels. I came here for something else." Jackson frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Zara's eyes locked onto his, her gaze intense. "I came here because I want to change something. I want a future, and I want to stop being a tool. I don't care about your war, your mission, or even your people." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But if I help you defeat the rebels, you can give me something I can't get on my own." Jackson stood still, his mind racing. "What do you want from me?" Zara's voice dropped to a whisper, and for a moment, Jackson thought he misheard her. "I want you to impregnate me." Jackson blinked, not sure if he heard right. His mind struggled to process the words. "What?" Zara's expression was unreadable. "It's not what you think. I'm not asking for love or anything romantic. I'm asking for a child from a human. I believe that if I carry your child, I can change things. I can change my future, and maybe the future of my people too. You humans have something we don't. Strength. You can give me a chance at something better." Jackson stared at her in shock. He had expected a lot of things from this mission, but never this. It felt wrong. It was strange. It didn't make sense. But then, as he looked at Zara, standing before him, fierce and broken, with so much pain in her eyes, he saw something more. He saw that she wasn't just asking for an impossible gift. She was asking for a way out of the cage her people had trapped her in. She wanted freedom, a chance to escape the oppression that had defined her life. "You really think having my child will change everything?" Jackson asked, his voice low, trying to understand. Zara didn't flinch. "Yes, it will show my people that we can have something else, something new. It will prove we don't have to follow the path they've set for us. And maybe your people will help us too. But only if we prove it's possible. Only if it's real. Jackson took a step back, his thoughts spinning. This wasn't part of the plan. His mission had nothing to do with starting a family, especially not with someone like Zara. She was an alien, and she was right. There was nothing romantic about the idea. But for the first time, Jackson wasn't sure what to think. "I can't promise you that," he said, shaking his head. "But I'll help you with the rebels. That's all I can do." Zara nodded, her expression hardening again. "Then let's finish this. After the rebels are gone, we'll see what happens." Jackson wasn't sure how this would all end, but one thing was clear. Nothing about this mission was going to be simple. And somehow, despite everything, he felt that Zara was the key to something much bigger than either of them had expected. The rebel camp was now in total chaos. The explosion had done its job, but it was just the beginning. Rebel soldiers were on high alert, trying to reorganize after the surprise attack. Jackson and Zara, crouching behind some thick trees, watched the scene unfold. They knew the next few moments would determine everything. "We move now," Zara whispered, her voice low but firm. Jackson nodded, his pulse racing. The tension in the air was thick, and every moment that passed felt like it could be their last. They had no time to waste. "Follow my lead," Zara continued, her eyes scanning the rebel camp from a distance. "I'll take the west side. You take the east. We strike at the same time. Hit them fast." Jackson was ready. He had trained for moments like this. He had been in enough battles to know that staying ahead of the enemy was the key to winning. But this mission felt different. There was something personal about it now, something deeper than just a fight. He couldn't shake the feeling that his partnership with Zara had turned into something more complicated than he expected. "You got it," he replied, though his mind was still spinning with the unexpected conversation they'd had earlier. Zara had asked him for something he never imagined, and now he was trying to focus on the task at hand. They both moved swiftly, their steps silent on the forest floor. Jackson could feel the weight of the mission pressing on him, but he pushed his doubts aside. This wasn't about him. It was about Zara's future. And maybe, just maybe, about ending this war. The sounds of distant voices echoed from the rebel camp. Jackson took a deep breath and adjusted his weapon. He had to stay calm. This wasn't just a mission to gather intel anymore. It had become a fight for survival. For both of them. Zara made the first move. She was like a shadow, slipping through the trees, her body moving with purpose. Jackson followed, keeping his distance, watching her closely as she took down two rebel soldiers with quiet precision. They didn't see her coming. Her skills were incredible. Jackson, knowing his role, moved toward the eastern side. As he crept closer to the edge of the camp, he could see the rebel leader's tent ahead. It was where the most important information would be. If he could get inside and grab the intel, it would be a massive blow to their forces. But just as he was about to make his move, a voice shouted, "There! We've got company." Jackson froze. Rebel soldiers had spotted him. He had no choice but to act quickly. He fired his weapon, taking out the closest soldier, but more rebels were coming. He needed backup. "Zara," Jackson called out, his voice urgent. From the shadows, Zara appeared, moving with lightning speed. She was right behind him in an instant, taking down another soldier before he could raise his weapon. Together, they moved like a well-oiled machine, each covering the other's back. Jackson was impressed by Zara's skill. She didn't hesitate, didn't waste a second. It was like she was born for this. Her determination reminded him of his own, but there was something different about her, something that made her more dangerous, more unpredictable. "Keep moving," Zara shouted, and Jackson didn't need any more encouragement. He followed her, charging toward the rebel leader's tent. They burst into the tent without warning, catching the leader and his officers by surprise. Jackson's heart was pounding in his chest as he aimed his weapon at the leader. Zara was already moving toward the table, scanning the papers and maps strewn across it. "Where is it?" Zara muttered to herself, rifling through the documents. Jackson kept his eyes on the rebels, making sure none of them had any funny ideas. Finally, Zara pulled out a small datapad, her face lighting up with victory. "Got it," she said, a slight smirk on her lips. Before Jackson could say anything, the rebel leader raised his hands in surrender. "Please, we have valuable information. We can work together. Just don't kill us." His voice was desperate, pleading. Zara didn't flinch. She knew the leader's type all too well. They only surrendered when they were cornered, when they had no way out, and Zara didn't trust them. Not one bit. "Don't waste my time," she said coldly. "We're not here for a deal." With a swift movement, she knocked the leader out cold, leaving him unconscious on the ground. Jackson was taken aback by how quickly she made the decision. There was no hesitation, no mercy. And somehow, it felt right. They didn't have time for games. They needed to get out, and fast. Zara grabbed the datapad, slipping it into her pouch. "We've got what we came for," she said, already moving toward the exit. "Let's go." Jackson followed, still processing everything that had just happened. They had done it. They had struck the heart of the rebel leadership and come out with the most valuable piece of intelligence they could have hoped for. But as he looked at Zara, he couldn't shake the feeling that their partnership had just shifted again. It wasn't just about the war anymore. There was something more between them now. Something unspoken, something that neither of them had expected. Jackson and Zara didn't waste any time after the attack on the rebel camp. The sounds of chaos and gunfire echoed in the distance, but they were already deep in the jungle, heading back to their rendezvous point. The mission had gone better than expected, but something was off. Jackson could feel it, a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. He glanced at Zara, who walked ahead of him, the datapad safely hidden in her pouch. Her expression was unreadable, as it always was, but something in her posture seemed different. The cold, calculating warrior he had known since the start of their mission now felt like a stranger, a shadow of something more. "You okay?" Jackson asked, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but underneath there was a thread of concern. Zara didn't look at him. "I'm fine," she replied flatly. Jackson wasn't convinced. He had seen her face before, seen the way her jaw tightened and her eyes narrowed when she was dealing with something painful. She wasn't fine, but he didn't press her for answers. Not yet. They continued their trek through the thick jungle, their footsteps muffled by the dense undergrowth. Jackson couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the rebel camp. He had followed the plan, but Zara had taken matters into her own hands. She didn't give the leader any chance to bargain or offer a truce. She had ended it, swiftly and decisively. It was a cold, efficient decision, and it made Jackson realize just how far Zara was willing to go to achieve her goals. But there was something unsettling about it. Zara wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for something more, something deeper. And that something, Jackson realized, might just involve him. As they reached a clearing, Zara finally slowed down and turned to face him. Her expression was hard again, but this time there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. A question. "I want to talk," she said, her voice quieter than usual. Jackson stopped in his tracks. "About what?" Zara took a deep breath, her eyes searching his face. "About what I asked you back there, before the mission started." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. He knew what she was referring to. Her request. The one he still wasn't sure how to process. He had been trying to push it out of his mind, but now there was no avoiding it. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his voice calm despite the storm of thoughts in his mind. Zara didn't hesitate. "Do you think I'm crazy?" Jackson shook his head. "No, I don't think you're crazy." "Then what do you think?" she asked, her voice sharp now. "You think I'm just using you. Using your people to get what I want." Jackson took a step closer to her, his gaze steady. "No, I think you're desperate. I think you've been stuck in a world that's been taking everything from you. and you're just trying to find a way out, a way to survive." Zara's eyes softened for a brief moment, but she quickly masked it. She wasn't used to showing vulnerability. She had been trained to fight, to survive, to do whatever it took to stay alive. But Jackson was different. She didn't know how to deal with him, didn't know how to deal with the way he made her feel. "Survival isn't enough," Zara said quietly. "I've been surviving for years. I need more. I want a future. And I think a child from you is the only way to give me that." Jackson didn't say anything for a moment. He let her words sink in. He still didn't fully understand why she felt so strongly about this, but he knew one thing for sure. She wasn't asking for this out of selfishness. She was asking for something that could change her life, her people's future, and maybe even the balance of power in the war. But it was still a lot to ask, and he wasn't sure if he could give it to her. "I can't promise you anything," he said, his voice low. "I don't know if I can be what you need." Zara met his gaze, her expression intense. "You don't need to be anything. I just need you to help me take that first step. After that, I'll figure out the rest. We both will." Jackson stood there torn. He wanted to help her. He truly did, but there were too many complications, too many unknowns. "I didn't come here to be part of a war that isn't mine," Jackson said, his voice quiet but firm. "But you've made me part of it. And that's the truth. I can't walk away from this now. Not after everything we've been through." Zara nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer. She took a deep breath, as though preparing herself for what was to come. "Then we have a deal," she said. Her tone was final, but there was something softer in her eyes now. "We fight together. We win together. And after that, we see what happens." Jackson didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. This mission had become more than just a fight for victory. It was now a fight for survival, and for something far more personal than either of them could have predicted. And as they continued their journey, side by side, Jackson couldn't help but wonder what would happen when the war was over. Would they both get what they wanted? Or would it all end in the same cold silence that had defined Zara's life up until now? Jackson and Zara walked in silence as they made their way deeper into the jungle, away from the rebel camp. The mission was technically over. They had the datapad with all the vital information. But Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of their journey was just beginning. Zara was still ahead of him, moving with the same confidence and speed she always had. But Jackson noticed a difference in her now. Her shoulders were a little less tense, her steps a little more deliberate, like she was carrying the weight of more than just their mission. He couldn't help but wonder if the conversation they'd had earlier about having a child was still on her mind. It was hard to ignore. It was impossible to forget. They reached a small clearing near a river, the sound of rushing water filling the air. Zara stopped and crouched beside a patch of grass, scanning their surroundings. Jackson did the same, keeping his eyes peeled for any signs of danger. "We'll rest here for a bit," Zara said, her voice quieter than usual. "Just until nightfall. After that, we'll move out again." Jackson nodded but didn't sit. He stayed standing, his mind far from the present. He had been in countless dangerous situations, but this felt different. There was a personal connection now, one he hadn't expected. And even though he knew they couldn't afford distractions, the truth was Zara had already changed the course of his life, in more ways than one. "I know what you're thinking," Zara said suddenly, breaking his train of thought. She didn't even look at him, but somehow her words felt like a challenge. Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what's that?" "You're thinking about the deal," she said flatly, now turning to face him. "Wondering if it's worth it. If it's really something you want to be a part of." Jackson didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. Zara knew him better than anyone else. He'd never been great at hiding what was on his mind, especially when it came to her. "Zara, I don't know what to think," he said finally, his voice full of frustration. This isn't just some mission anymore. You're asking me for something that feels wrong. It feels too much. I never signed up for this. Zara's expression softened, but she didn't back down. I didn't sign up for this either. I didn't ask for any of this, she said, her voice surprisingly calm. But sometimes you don't get to choose your path. Sometimes the only choice you have is to take what you can, even if it's not what you expected. Jackson looked away, feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't just about a child. It wasn't just about her request. It was about everything they had been through together. The battles, the survival, the moments where they had relied on each other. He felt something in his chest, a tug he couldn't explain. He wasn't sure if it was guilt, desire, or something else entirely, but it was there. And it was growing stronger. "What if I can't give you what you want?" Jackson asked quietly. What if this mission, this whole war, takes us to places we can't come back from?" Zara stared at him for a long moment, her gaze steady. "Then we deal with it, together, just like we've been doing this entire time. We don't have the luxury of doubt. Not anymore." Jackson couldn't deny the truth in her words. There was no turning back now. They had crossed a line, and both of them knew it. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. "So, what now?" Jackson asked. The question had more meaning than just the mission. It was about them, about where this would go. Zara stood up and walked closer to him, her eyes never leaving his. "Now we finish what we started. The rebels are still out there, and they're not going to stop coming. And once we've dealt with them, we figure out what happens next." Jackson wasn't sure he was ready for that. The mission had always been clear, to stop the rebels. But now, everything was tangled up in something much bigger. A child, a future, a new life for Zara, maybe even for him too. He didn't know if he could give her that future, but he knew he couldn't just walk away. "And after that?" Jackson asked, his voice almost a whisper. "What happens after we're done?" Zara paused for a moment, her gaze shifting toward the river, the rushing water that seemed to mirror the turmoil inside her. "We'll see. I've never been good at promises, Jackson, but I can promise you this. We will change things, together. And no matter what happens, I'll make sure you never regret helping me." Jackson stood there for a long time, watching Zara as she turned away, looking toward the horizon. Her words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, he wasn't sure what the future held. But he knew that whatever came next, he wouldn't be facing it alone. They were in this together, for better or for worse. The night had fallen, and the jungle was alive with sounds. The distant calls of creatures, the rustling of leaves, the constant hum of insects. It was as if the world was continuing on, oblivious to the choices that Jackson and Zara had made. They sat side by the fire, the flames casting long shadows on their faces. The datapad, the one that contained the key to ending the war, lay between them, a symbol of everything they had fought for. But now, as Jackson looked at it, it felt less like a victory and more like a burden. Zara had been quiet for a while, her eyes fixed on the fire. Jackson wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but the weight of the conversation they had earlier still hung in the air. There was so much he wanted to understand about her, about the real reason she had asked him to stay, to help her, but the words wouldn't come. "Do you regret it?" Zara's voice cut through the silence, low and uncertain. Jackson looked at her. The question had caught him off guard. Regret what? She glanced at him briefly, her face unreadable. "Everything. The mission, the choices we've made, all of it." Jackson didn't hesitate. "No, I don't regret helping you. Not in the way you're thinking." Zara's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't say anything more. Instead, she turned her attention back to the fire. Jackson could tell she wasn't satisfied with his answer, but he didn't know how to explain himself any better. He had been thrust into this situation, this war, this alliance with Zara, without any say in it. But now he realized something. He couldn't walk away. Not anymore. The mission wasn't just about stopping the rebels. It was about finding something they both needed. A future. A reason to keep fighting. You know, Jackson began, his voice quiet but steady. When I first came here, I thought I was just going to do a job. Just another mission. But this has turned into something I never expected. Zara looked at him now, curiosity flickering in her eyes. What do you mean? Jackson paused, trying to find the right words. I thought it was just about stopping the enemy. But it's not. It's about surviving. Together. I don't know what happens after this mission is over. I don't know what kind of future you think we can have. But I know that, right now, I can't do this without you. Zara's lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. Instead, she reached down and picked up the datapad. It was the key to ending the war, to making everything right, but also the thing that had tied them together in ways neither of them had planned. We're close, she said softly, turning the device over in her hands. We just need to reach the command center. Once we deliver this, the war will end. Jackson felt a wave of uncertainty. Zara had been so focused on the war, on survival, that he wondered if she had ever thought about what would come after. What would happen when the dust settled, when the fighting was over? After all this is done, Jackson said carefully, what happens to us? What happens when the war is over? Zara didn't answer right away. Instead, she set the datapad down beside the fire and stood up. She gazed into the distance, her face softening for the first time in days. I don't know, she said, her voice distant. I only know what I need right now. The war needs to end. And maybe we can figure the rest out later. Jackson nodded slowly, though a part of him wasn't satisfied with that answer. There were too many things they hadn't talked about. Too many things left unsaid between them. But maybe that was just the way it had to be. You know, Jackson said after a long pause, I didn't think I could do this. I didn't think I could be a part of your world. But now, I don't know. I think we're more alike than I ever realized. Zara glanced back at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. I think you're right, she said, her voice softer than usual. We're both fighting for something. Maybe we're both just trying to find a way to belong. Jackson stood up and walked over to her. The distance between them felt smaller now, not just physically but emotionally. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future would hold. But in that moment, he knew that Zara was no longer just a mission, no longer just a soldier. She was someone he cared about. And maybe that was enough for now. The war wasn't over yet. They still had a mission to complete. But as they stood there, side by side, Jackson felt a new sense of determination. They would finish this together. And maybe, just maybe, there was a future for them beyond the battle. As they walked off into the night, Jackson's mind was finally at ease. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And maybe that was the most important victory of all. The day after they met, Zara and Jackson set out for the rebel stronghold. The air was thick with tension, and the atmosphere seemed to hum with the promise of danger. Jackson had led many missions before, but something about this one felt different. He didn't know if it was the strange connection he felt with Zara or the fact that the rebels were more dangerous than they seemed. As they moved through the dense jungle, Jackson kept his eyes on Zara. She moved with a quiet confidence, her sharp gaze scanning the surroundings. She didn't seem to be worried about the danger. She walked with the same cold determination that she had shown when they first met, as if nothing could stop her. And yet, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye. "Why are you helping us?" Jackson asked, breaking the silence. Zara didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed focused ahead as she spoke. "I'm not helping you. I'm helping myself." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "How does betraying your people help you?" Zara paused and finally turned to face him. "You think this war is just about sides. It's not. I've been used by my people for years. I'm just a tool to them. They don't care about me. They only care about winning." Jackson could hear the bitterness in her voice. He didn't know the full story, but it was clear that Zara wasn't just another rebel sympathizer. She was different. She had been broken by her own kind, used up and tossed aside. "So, you just decided to help the humans instead?" Jackson asked, genuinely curious. Zara shook her head. "No, I'm helping myself. If you win, it's not about me. But if I help you, I'll have a chance at a new life. A life where I'm not someone's weapon." Jackson nodded, understanding her words but not fully trusting them. She had her own reasons for being here, but for now, they aligned with his mission. That was all that mattered. Suddenly, the sound of movement in the bushes broke the silence. Zara raised her hand, signaling Jackson to stop. She crouched low, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the area. Jackson did the same, his hand going to the weapon at his side. The bushes rustled again, and then, from the shadows, a group of rebel soldiers emerged, their weapons raised. They had clearly been watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Zara didn't hesitate. Without a word, she lunged forward, moving like a shadow. Jackson was right behind her, his training kicking in as he quickly assessed the situation. The rebels didn't expect them to strike so fast, and for a moment, they hesitated. That was all the time Zara needed. With incredible speed, Zara took down the first soldier. Her movements were fluid, almost graceful, and yet brutal. Jackson followed her lead, firing his weapon, and taking down 2 more rebels in quick succession. The rest of the rebels scattered, retreating into the jungle, but not before Zara got in one last shot, disabling their leader. Jackson looked at her in surprise. He had known she was strong, but he hadn't realized just how capable she was. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a warrior. "You're good," Jackson said, catching his breath. Zara gave him a short nod. "I don't fight for fun. I fight to survive." They moved quickly, dragging the rebel leader's unconscious body away from the battlefield. Jackson was starting to see just how deep Zara's skills went. This wasn't just some alien who had been thrown into a war. Zara was someone who had been shaped by years of pain and struggle. She had learned how to fight not because she wanted to, but because she had no other choice. As they continued their journey, Jackson found himself thinking about her more and more. There was something about her, something that didn't fit the usual picture of a cold, emotionless soldier. Zara wasn't just a tool to be used. She had her own code, her own sense of right and wrong. And Jackson couldn't help but feel a strange connection to her, despite everything. By the time they reached the rebel stronghold, Jackson was more certain than ever that this mission wasn't just about gathering intel. It was about something bigger, something more personal. Zara's eyes were cold as they surveyed the rebel camp in the distance, but Jackson could see the smallest flicker of doubt in her gaze. She wasn't just helping him because she had to. There was something else driving her. Before they could move any closer, a sudden explosion rocked the ground beneath their feet. Both of them dropped to the ground, instinctively reaching for their weapons. The camp had been hit. "Rebel ambush," Zara muttered, getting to her feet quickly. "This isn't over. They know we're coming." Jackson's heart raced. This was it, the first real test of their uneasy alliance. They weren't just dealing with the rebels anymore. They were dealing with an enemy who knew how to fight back. "Let's finish this," Jackson said, his voice low and determined. Zara nodded, her eyes locked on the camp ahead. "We fight, or we die. Together." And with that, they charged forward, side by side, ready to face whatever the rebels threw at them.